They refused to bury him with the town. So Elias Boone took a shovel and did it alone before the sun could rise. The ground was still cold when the first light touched the hills, the kind of cold that clung to your boots and didn't let go. And Elias stood there beside the shallow grave, hat low, hands steady, like a man who had already made peace with being unwelcome in every direction. The town sat half a mile behind him, quiet now, but he could still hear their words from the night before, low voices, tight jaws, the kind that didn't need shouting to carry weight, telling him to leave it be, telling him it wasn't his concern, telling him some lines weren't meant to be crossed, not by a man who wanted to keep what little land he had left. But Elias had never been good at pretending not to see what was right in front of him. And last night, what was in front of him was a body laid out under the open sky, wrapped in nothing but silence. And something about that didn't sit right in his bones. He drove the shovel into the dirt again, slow, measured, each push breaking the earth just enough, not more than needed. Because this wasn't about making a statement, it was about finishing something no one else would start. The wind moved across the dry grass, carrying the smell of dust and old wood, brushing past the fence posts that leaned like tired men, and somewhere in the distance a horse shifted its weight, leather creaking soft. The kind of sound that usually meant morning was coming like it always did, steady, predictable, unchanged. But this morning felt different. Elias wiped his brow with the back of his hand, though the air was cool, and glanced once toward the ridge line. Just a habit, just a man checking his horizon. But his eyes lingered a second longer than usual. Nothing moved out there, not yet, just the pale stretch of land and the faint line where sky met earth. But there was a feeling, quiet, persistent, like something watching from a distance too far to see. He looked back down at the grave, at the worn bracelet still looped around the man's wrist, simple leather, nothing fancy, but held with care, and Elias hesitated before covering it. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he did. He left it there. Some things weren't his to take. The first edge of sunlight broke over the hills then, thin and gold, stretching long shadows across the ground, touching the top of the fresh dirt, and for a moment everything went still, the kind of still that settles in before a storm. Though the sky was clear, Elias straightened up, resting one hand on the shovel, and that's when he heard it, faint at first, almost mistaken for wind, a rhythm too steady to ignore, hoofbeats. He didn't turn right away, just listened, one set, then another, then more, the sound layering, building, not fast, not rushed, but certain. He lifted his eyes slowly toward the ridge again, and this time the horizon wasn't empty. Shapes began to form against the light, dark against gold, one rider, then five, then more behind them, spreading across the line like a tide that didn't need water. Elias exhaled once, quiet, not fear, not surprise, just recognition that whatever came next had already begun. He set the shovel down beside the grave, brushed the dirt from his hands, and stood there, alone between the town that wouldn't stand with him and the riders who hadn't yet spoken, the sunlight rising behind them, turning their figures into silhouettes. And for the first time in 12 years, Elias Boone realized the morning wasn't his anymore. The riders did not rush the hill. They did not shout. They did not reach for anything that might turn a quiet morning into something louder. They simply moved forward at a pace that felt older than the land itself, steady and deliberate. And Elias Boone stood where he was, boots planted in dry soil, watching the distance close one measured step at a time. He had seen men ride like that before, not in years, but long enough ago to remember the difference between noise and purpose. And these men carried purpose the way others carried rifles, low and certain, without the need to show it. The first rider came into clearer view as the sun lifted higher, the light catching on beads woven into dark hair, on leather worn smooth by weather and time. And Elias noticed the details the way a man notices things when he knows they might matter later. The spacing between horses, the silence between them, the absence of hurry. He counted without meaning to, 1, then 3, then 8, and behind them more shapes followed, stretching farther than he could place a number on, and the sound of hooves filled the open land not as a threat, but as a statement, like the earth itself acknowledging their arrival. Elias reached for his hat brim and pressed it down slightly, not out of fear, but habit. The kind of small movement a man makes when he understands he is no longer alone in a decision he thought was his to carry. He glanced once toward the grave behind him, the fresh dirt still uneven, the bracelet barely visible where it rested against the man's wrist beneath the soil, and something in his chest tightened, not regret, not doubt, just the weight of knowing that whatever came next would not be undone by anything he could say. The lead rider slowed about 20 yards out, close enough now that Elias could see the lines on his face, the calm in his eyes, and the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but held it anyway. And behind him the others fanned out slightly, not surrounding, not pressing, just taking their place like pieces of something larger than any one man. No one spoke, not at first, and the silence stretched in a way that made the smallest sounds feel louder, the shift of leather, the soft breath of horses, the faint whisper of wind across dry grass. Elias did not move toward them, and he did not step back. He simply stood, hands at his sides, shoulders square, the way a man stands when he has already chosen his ground. The lead rider's gaze moved past him for a moment, settling on the mound of fresh earth, and something changed there, not in a way that could be named easily, just a slight stillness, a pause that held meaning without needing words. Elias followed that gaze, then looked back again, and for the first time since the riders appeared, he felt something shift inside him, not fear, not yet, but the understanding that he had stepped into a story that had begun long before he ever picked up that shovel. He remembered the night before, the way the town had turned its back, the way the lantern light had flickered against faces that refused to meet his eyes, and how easy it would have been to walk away, to leave the man where he lay and let the wind and time handle the rest. But Elias had never been built for that kind of distance. The rider dismounted then, slow, deliberate, boots touching the ground with the same quiet certainty as the hooves that brought him there. And though he still had not spoken, the air between them shifted again, heavier now, like the moment before a question is asked that cannot be. Taken back, Elias drew a slow breath, tasting dust and sunlight, and realized something he had not allowed himself to think until now, that this was not about what he had done, not entirely. It was about what it meant, and meanings had a way of traveling farther than a man ever intended. The rider took one step forward, then another, stopping just short of the grave, his eyes never leaving the earth, and Elias watched closely, waiting for anger, for accusation, for anything that would give shape to what was coming. But none of it arrived. Only that same steady quiet, the kind that settles deep and refuses to be rushed. Somewhere behind the line of riders, a horse shifted, and a small breeze carried the scent of sage through the air, and in that moment, Elias Boone understood that whatever this was, it was not going to be settled with words alone, and the morning, which had started with a single man and a shovel, had become something else entirely. The man by the grave finally spoke, and his voice did not rise above the wind. It moved with it, low and steady, as if the words had been waiting longer than the morning itself. He said something in a language Elias did not understand, not fully, but the tone carried enough. It was not a question, not yet, more like a marking of presence, like a man acknowledging what stood before him without deciding what it meant. Elias did not answer right away. He held his ground, eyes moving from the man to the others behind him, noticing how none of them shifted, none of them reached for anything, and that stillness pressed heavier than any threat could have. The rider's gaze lifted from the grave to Elias then, and for a brief moment their eyes met in a way that felt direct, unhidden, the kind of look that asked for truth without asking for words. Elias cleared his throat, slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice came out even, not defensive, not proud, just plain, like everything else about him. He said he found the man out on the edge of his land just before nightfall, said the sky had already gone dark and the wind had started to turn, said no one from the town came when he asked, and so he did what needed doing. The words settled into the space between them and did not move, and the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was something in the way his shoulders eased just slightly, something small, almost unnoticeable, that shifted the air by a fraction. One of the riders behind him stepped forward then, only a pace, just enough to be seen more clearly, and in his hand, he carried a small piece of cloth, worn, blue, nothing remarkable except for the way he held it, careful, like it belonged somewhere it had not yet reached. Elias's eyes followed the cloth, and a memory stirred, quiet but persistent, the shape of a night not yet finished. He saw again the lantern swinging in the wind, the way the shadows stretched across his porch, and the moment he first noticed movement near the fence line, not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in the dark that did not belong to the wind. He had stepped out then, slow, cautious, one hand resting near the doorframe, and that was. When he saw her, the girl, smaller than he expected, wrapped in dust and silence, standing just inside the edge of his land like she was not sure if she had the right to be there. Her eyes had found his immediately, wide, alert, but not wild. There was something else in them, something measured, like she was deciding whether to trust him in the same breath she was deciding whether she had any other choice. She did not speak at first, just stood there, and Elias remembered how the wind had moved around them, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant rain, and how time had seemed to stretch just enough to make the moment feel heavier than it should have been. He had asked her if she needed water, simple words, nothing more, and she had nodded once, barely, and that had been enough. Elias blinked, the memory folding back into the present, and he looked again at the piece of blue cloth in the rider's hand, and this time he recognized it, not as something from the man he buried, but from the girl, a torn edge from her sleeve, the same one that had caught on the fence post when she stumbled stepping onto his land. The rider extended the cloth slightly, not offering it, not accusing, just showing it, and Elias felt the weight of the connection settle into place, quiet and undeniable. The man near the grave spoke again, a few more words, slower this time, and though Elias still did not understand them fully, he caught one thing, a name, spoken with care, and he realized then that this was not about the man in the ground alone. It was about the girl who had stood in his yard with dust on her face and something unspoken in her eyes. Elias let out a breath he had not noticed he was holding, and for the first time since the riders appeared, he understood that the story had not begun with the grave. It had begun the night before, with a girl who had stepped across his fence line and a choice he had made without knowing who would come asking about it at sunrise. The memory did not come back all at once. It moved in pieces, like wind pushing dust across a dry field, revealing one shape at a time, and Elias stood there with the riders watching him as the night before unfolded again behind his eyes, clearer now, heavier. The girl had not stepped fully into the light at first. She had stayed near the fence line, one hand resting against the rough wood as if she needed to feel something solid beneath her. And Elias remembered how the lantern on his porch had flickered just enough to show the tear along her sleeve, the same blue cloth now held in the rider's hand, and the way her breathing had been steady but shallow, controlled, like someone who had learned not to waste strength on fear. He had taken a step closer back then, slow, careful, giving her space to move if she chose, and when he held out the canteen, she had hesitated for only a second before reaching for it, her fingers brushing his briefly, not pulling away, not clinging either, just accepting what was offered without asking for more. She had drunk in small sips, measured, as if she knew exactly how much she could take without slowing herself down, and when she handed it back, her eyes had searched his face in a way that made him realize she was not just looking at him, she was reading him. Elias had asked where she came from, but she had not answered, not with words. Instead she glanced once toward the hills, then back at him, and that had been enough to tell him there was something behind her, something she had chosen not to bring to his door. He had nodded once, not pressing, and turned toward the house, leaving the door open without saying she could follow, because some things did not need to be spoken. She had stepped inside after a moment, quiet as the wind slipping through a crack in the wall, and Elias remembered how the room had seemed smaller with her there, not because of her size, but because of the way she carried herself, alert, aware, every movement placed with intention. He had set a pot of water near the stove, the faint smell of wood smoke rising as the fire caught, and she had stood near the doorway at first, not sitting, not settling, just watching, until he placed a folded cloth on the table and stepped back, giving her space again. She had moved then, slowly, lowering herself onto the chair as if testing whether it would hold, and Elias had turned his back to give her privacy, staring instead at the worn boards of the wall, counting the knots in the wood to pass the time. hearing only the quiet rustle of fabric and the steady rhythm of her breathing. When he finally looked again, the tear in her sleeve had been wrapped, the blue cloth tied neatly, not wasted, not discarded, and she had placed the remaining strip carefully on the table, like it mattered. They had not spoken much after that. Only a few words, simple ones, about water, about rest, about the road beyond his land, and each answer she gave had been short, direct, never more than needed. At some point in the night, the wind had shifted, carrying a sound from far off, something Elias almost missed, a faint echo of movement across the hills, and he had seen the girl's head lift slightly, her eyes sharpening, not afraid, but ready. She had stood then, adjusting the cloth at her arm, and for a moment Elias thought she might leave without a word, but instead she stepped closer to the door, paused, and turned back toward him. She had said something then, soft, in her own language, and though he did not understand the words, the tone carried a kind of weight he could not ignore, not gratitude exactly, not a promise either, something in between, something that settled into the room and stayed there after she was gone. She had left before the sky began to lighten, slipping out into the dark with the same quiet certainty she had arrived with, and Elias had watched her cross the edge of his land, the blue of her sleeve catching the faint starlight for just a second before she disappeared into the hills. He had stood there longer than he needed to, listening to the night, feeling that same quiet sense that something had changed without asking his permission. Now, standing by the grave with the riders before him, Elias looked again at the cloth in the man's hand, at the way it had been carried all this way, and he understood that the moment the girl stepped across his fence had not been small, not to them, not to anyone who had followed her trail to this place, and whatever he thought he had done that night, simple as it seemed, had already begun to reach farther than his land could hold. The wind shifted again, softer this time, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and something older, something that did not belong to the ranch or the town behind it. And Elias Boone felt it settle into the space around him as the riders remained still, their presence stretching across the land like a line drawn without sound. The man near the grave lowered the piece of blue cloth slowly, his fingers holding it with care before letting it rest against his palm, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not long, just enough to mark something unseen, something that did not need words. When he opened them again, his gaze returned to Elias, and this time there was a question in it, quiet but clear, not about what had happened, but about why. Elias shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dry earth, and he answered the only way he knew how, without dressing it up, without turning it into something larger than it was. He said she came to his land and needed help, and that was reason enough. The words sounded simple in the open air, almost too simple, but they did not falter, and he did not look away when he said them. The riders did not react right away, no nods, no murmurs, just that same steady stillness. But something in the air changed, subtle, like the first sign of rain you feel before you see it. One of the younger men shifted in his saddle, his eyes moving from Elias to the grave and back again, and though he said nothing, the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, a small release that did not go unnoticed. Elias glanced once more at the mound of fresh dirt, at the way the sunlight now touched it fully, warming the surface, and he wondered briefly if he should have said more, if there were words that could explain the choice he made in a way that others might understand. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because he knew that some things were not meant to be explained, only done. The man by the grave stepped closer then, just one pace, and the others behind him did not follow. They stayed where they were, holding their distance as if this moment belonged only to the two men standing on either side of the freshly turned earth. He knelt slowly, placing the piece of blue cloth on top of the grave, smoothing it once with his hand, and Elias watched closely, not interrupting, not stepping forward, just witnessing, because that was what this had become, not a confrontation, not yet, but a witnessing of something that had already been decided long before either of them arrived here. The man spoke again, softer now, and though the words were not in a language Elias knew, there was a weight to them that carried through tone alone, a kind of recognition, a naming of what had been done, and Elias felt it settle into him, not as approval, not as judgment, but as something in between, something that did not need to choose sides. The silence that followed was different from before, less tight, less uncertain, and the riders seemed to breathe with it, their horses shifting slightly, hooves pressing into the ground with a quieter rhythm. Elias lifted his eyes toward the horizon for just a second, then back again. And that was when he noticed something he had missed before, at the far edge of the group. Just beyond the line of men and horses, a smaller figure stood, not hidden, but not at the center either, her presence easy to overlook if you were not looking for it. The blue of her sleeve caught the light, faint but unmistakable, and Elias felt that same quiet recognition settle in his chest. She had returned, not with noise, not with urgency, but with the same stillness she had carried the night before, and she stood there now among them, watching, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. She did not step forward, she did not speak, she simply remained, and Elias understood then that whatever had brought these riders to his land had not been driven by anger alone, nor by loss, but by something else entirely, something that had begun the moment he chose to open his door. He looked back at the man by the grave, then once more at the girl at the edge of the group, and in that quiet space between them, he realized that the question had never been whether he did the right thing, but whether he was ready to stand with it when it came back to him, carried across miles of land by those who had followed her trail all the way to his door. The girl did not move at first, and neither did the men around her, but something in the air shifted the moment Elias saw her, subtle as a breath drawn before speaking, and though no one turned to look at her directly, her presence seemed to ripple outward, changing the shape of the silence. Elias kept his eyes on her for a second longer than he intended, then returned his gaze to the man by the grave, because he understood that whatever came next would not begin with her, it would begin with him. The man straightened slowly from where he had placed the cloth, brushing a small amount of dust from his hand, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight now, not questioning, not observing, but deciding. He spoke in English this time, careful, measured, each word placed like a stone. He said the man in the ground had a name, and he gave it, and though Elias had never heard it before, the way it was spoken made it clear that it carried more than just identity. It carried history, belonging, something that did not end with the grave beneath them. Elias nodded once, not repeating the name, not because he did not respect it, but because he knew it was not his to carry aloud. The man continued, saying that the one buried there had followed a trail that led away from his people, that he had walked alone for some time, and that when they found his path again, it ended here. Elias listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, but his mind moved quietly through the pieces, fitting them together, without forcing them into place. The girl shifted then, just slightly, stepping out from the line of riders, not fully forward, but enough that the light caught her more clearly, and Elias could see now that the wrap around her arm had been replaced, cleaner, tighter, the blue cloth gone from her sleeve because it now rested on the grave between them. Her eyes met his again, steady as before, but there was something new in them, not urgency, not fear, something closer to resolve. The man noticed her movement without turning his head, and for a brief moment his voice paused, as if allowing space for her presence to settle into what he was saying. Then he spoke again, explaining that she had come to Elias's land carrying more than her own path, that she had been sent ahead, not lost, not wandering, but moving with purpose that had not yet been seen clearly by those who followed. Elias felt that land inside him shift, not the dirt beneath his boots, but the ground he stood on in his own understanding, and he realized then that the girl had not arrived by chance, and that his choice had not been made in isolation the way he had believed. He glanced toward her again, and this time she did not look away. She held his gaze with that same quiet certainty, and for the first time he saw something that had been there all along, but had not revealed itself fully. Trust, not given easily, not offered lightly, but present nonetheless. The riders behind her remained still, but their formation had changed without movement. The tension that had once held them rigid now softened, their presence no longer pressing inward, but settling around the space like a boundary that did not need to close. The man by the grave took a step back then, creating a small distance between himself and the mound of earth, and in doing so, he shifted the focus of the moment away from the past and toward what stood before him now. He looked directly at Elias, And there was no challenge in his eyes, no demand, only a quiet expectation, the kind that waits without forcing an answer. Elias drew in a slow breath. The morning air warmer now as the sun climbed higher, and he understood that this was the moment that mattered. Not the burial, not the night before, but what he would do standing here with all of it returned to him. He did not reach for anything, did not step away. He simply stood, shoulders squared, eyes steady, and let the silence hold long enough to show that he was not turning from it. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, sharp and clear, breaking the stillness just enough to remind him that the world beyond this moment still existed. But it felt far away now, like something he had stepped out of without noticing. The man watched him, the girl watched him, and the riders behind them held their place. And in that quiet, measured space, Elias Boone realized that whatever had begun with a simple act the night before had now become something that would ask more of him than he had ever intended to give. And the only question left was whether he would remain the same man who opened the door when it was only one person standing on the other side. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like fog lifting from a field, and Elias Boone felt it before he saw it. The subtle shift in the way the riders held themselves, the way their horses eased, the way the morning air no longer pressed against his chest. The man who had spoken took another step back from the grave, not retreating, not yielding, but making space, and that space settled between them like an invitation that did not need to be named. Elias understood it without being told, not because he had faced this moment before, but because something in him recognized the shape of it, the same quiet decision he had made the night before. Only now it stood in daylight, seen by more than just himself. He turned his head slightly toward the girl, just enough to acknowledge her without shifting his ground, and she answered that small movement with one of her own, stepping forward from the edge of the riders, not hurried, not hesitant, simply certain. As she moved, the line of men behind her parted without instruction, creating a path that had not been there a moment before, and Elias watched closely, noting how no one spoke, how no one needed to. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough now, that the dust on her boots, the careful wrap on her arm, the calm in her eyes all came into clear view. And for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to undo. She lifted her hand then, slowly, and pointed toward the grave, not accusing, not questioning, just acknowledging. And then she placed that same hand lightly against her chest, over her heart. And Elias felt the meaning settle in without needing translation. He nodded once, a small movement, but it carried everything he could not put into words. Behind her, the man who had spoken earlier watched this exchange with a steady gaze. And when the girl stepped back again, he inclined his head slightly, not to Elias alone, but to the space between them, to the choice that had been made and the way it had been carried through. Then something changed in a way Elias did not expect, not with a sudden motion, not with a loud declaration, but with a quiet, collective shift. The riders began to dismount, one by one, slow, deliberate, boots meeting the ground with soft thuds that echoed more in meaning than in sound. Elias's eyes moved across them as they stepped down, noticing how they did not spread out in threat, did not close in. Instead, they formed a wide arc, facing the grave, their attention settling not on him, but on the man beneath the earth. The horses were led back a few paces, reins held loosely, and the men stood with their heads slightly lowered, not in submission, but in recognition. Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not confusion, something closer to understanding, the kind that arrives quietly and leaves no room for doubt. The man who had spoken earlier moved to stand beside him now, not directly next to him, but near enough that their presence aligned, both facing the same direction, both looking at the same mound of fresh dirt. He spoke again, softly, and though Elias caught only parts of it, the tone was unmistakable. It was not about loss alone. It was about what had been preserved, what had been given when it could have been withheld. Elias let out a slow breath, his gaze steady on the grave. And in that moment he realized something that had not been clear before, that he had not simply buried a man. He had carried something across a line that others had refused to cross, and now that act had been seen, not judged, not taken from him, but accepted. The girl stood quietly a few steps away, her eyes moving between Elias and the grave, and there was no urgency in her posture, no need to rush what was unfolding. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting longer light across the land, warming the air, softening the edges of everything it touched, and the ranch, that had once felt like a place apart, now seemed to sit at the center of something larger, something that had arrived without force and without demand. Elias shifted his stance slightly, not to move away, but to stand more firmly, and as he did, he understood that whatever had been asked of him was not finished, not yet, but for the first time since the riders appeared, the weight of it did not feel like something pressing down on him. It felt like something he could carry. The circle did not close. It settled, like something finding its shape after being carried too long without one. And Elias Boone stood there with the men beside him, all of them facing the same ground, the same quiet mound of earth that had become more than just a resting place. The man who had spoken earlier lowered his head slightly, and the others followed, not in perfect unison, but close enough that it felt like one motion stretched across many bodies. And for a moment the only sound was the wind moving through the grass, soft, steady, as if it had been waiting for this silence to arrive. Elias did not lower his head right away, not out of defiance, but because he was still learning what this moment asked of him, and when he finally did, it was slow, deliberate, the same way he had driven the shovel into the ground at first light. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not long, just enough to mark that he understood, that he was present, and when he opened them again, the light had shifted slightly, warmer now, touching the edges of everything with a softer hand. The man beside him spoke once more, his voice quieter than before, but clearer, and this time the words carried meaning Elias could follow. He said that the one buried there had been a brother, not only by blood, but by path, by the way he had walked among them, and that his journey had not ended in shame, but in the hands of someone who chose to see him as a man, not as something to be turned away. Elias felt that settle into him, deeper than anything said so far, and he did not respond, because there was nothing to add that would not make it smaller than it was. The girl stepped forward again then, closing the distance between herself and the grave, and she knelt without hesitation, her movements steady, practiced, as if she had done this before, as if she understood exactly where to place her hands, exactly how to sit with what had been lost. She reached toward the blue cloth resting on the soil, adjusting it slightly, not correcting, just aligning it with care, and then she placed her palm gently against the earth, holding it there for a moment that stretched just long enough to carry meaning. Elias watched her, not intruding, not looking away, and in that quiet gesture he saw something he had not seen the night before, not just strength, but continuity, the kind that moves through people without asking permission, carrying stories forward, whether they are spoken or not. When she rose, she turned toward him, and for the first time since she arrived, she spoke in English, her voice soft but steady. She said, "Thank you," not as a formality, not as something owed, but as something chosen, and the words hung in the air between them, simple, unadorned, and heavier than anything else that had been said. Elias nodded once, again, the same small motion, but this time it carried a different weight, because now he understood what it answered. The man beside him stepped forward slightly, placing himself just ahead of Elias, not to block him, not to lead, but to mark a transition, and he raised his hand briefly, a small gesture, and the riders responded without hesitation, not with noise, not with movement toward him, but by turning, one by one, toward the open land beyond the ranch, as if something had been completed. Elias felt the shift immediately, the way the air opened, the way the tension that had once held everything in place released without breaking. The horses were brought forward again, reins gathered, saddles creaking softly as men prepared to mount, and still no one rushed, no one spoke louder than needed. Everything moved with the same quiet certainty that had brought them here. Elias glanced once more at the grave, at the cloth, at the place where the mourning had begun, and then back at the girl, who remained standing, not yet turning away, her gaze steady on him, as if waiting for something that had not been spoken yet. He held that gaze for a moment, longer than before, and in that space, something passed between them that did not need a name, an understanding that what had happened here would not end with this morning, that it would carry forward in ways neither of them could fully see yet. The man who had spoken earlier looked back once, meeting Elias's eyes with a quiet acknowledgment, not of debt, not of obligation, but of something shared, something that had been recognized and left intact. And as the riders began to move, their figures stretching once more across the land, Elias Boone stood beside the grave, the sunlight warm against his shoulders, and realized that nothing had been taken from him in this moment, nothing demanded, nothing forced, and yet something had changed all. The same, something that would not leave when the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded into the distance. The dust did not rise the way it usually did when riders left a place. It lifted slowly, as if even the land understood that this departure was not the end of something, but the continuation of it, and Elias Boone stood there beside the grave, watching as the line of men stretched thinner across the horizon, their shapes growing smaller with each passing second, until they became part of the distance they had come from. The sound of hooves faded in layers, first the closest, then the rest, until all that remained was the wind and the faint creak of leather that lingered like an echo refusing to leave all at once. Elias did not move right away. He kept his place, boots firm in the dirt, eyes steady on the path they had taken, not because he expected them to return, but because something in him knew this moment needed to be seen all the way through. The girl had not followed them immediately. She remained where she was, a few paces from the grave, her posture unchanged, her presence as quiet as it had been the night before, and when Elias finally turned toward her, he found her already looking at him, not waiting, not asking, just there. The space between them felt different now, not uncertain, not weighted with questions, but open, like a door that had already been stepped through. She took one step closer, then another, until she stood near enough that he could see the small details again. The way the cloth wrapped around her arm had been tied with care, the way the dust on her boots had settled into the seams, the way her eyes held steady without needing to prove anything. She reached into the fold of her garment then, slow, deliberate, and drew out something small, something that caught the light for just a second before she held it out toward him, a thin piece of leather, worn smooth, shaped into a simple band, and Elias recognized it before she spoke, not from memory, but from the way it carried itself, the same quiet weight as the one resting beneath the soil. She did not explain it. She did not tell him what it meant. She only extended it toward him, her hand steady, her gaze unchanged, and Elias understood without needing the words. This was not a payment, not a trade. It was a bridge. He hesitated for a brief moment, not out of doubt, but because he knew that taking it would mean something he could not set down later, and then he reached out, his fingers closing around the leather, feeling its texture, its warmth from her hand, and in that simple contact, something settled into place inside him, something that had been shifting since the night before. She nodded once, a small motion, mirroring his own from earlier, and then she stepped back, turning slightly toward the direction the riders had gone, but she did not follow them, not yet. Elias looked down at the band in his hand, then back at the grave, at the blue cloth resting on the earth, and he moved forward, just a single step, placing the leather gently beside the cloth, not burying it, not keeping it, but letting it rest where it belonged for now. When he straightened again, the girl was watching him, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not relief, not gratitude, something quieter, something that felt like recognition. She turned then, finally, walking toward the open land, her steps measured, unhurried, and Elias watched as she moved farther away, her figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of horizon, until she reached the point where the others had disappeared, and then she paused, just for a second, glancing back once, not to check, not to call, just to mark the moment. And then she continued on, becoming part of the distance just like the rest. The ranch fell silent again after that, the kind of silence Elias had known for years, but it no longer felt the same. It no longer pressed in on him from all sides. It seemed to sit beside him instead, like something that understood it did not have to fill every space. He stood there for a while longer, the sun now high enough to warm his shoulders fully, the air carrying the steady rhythm of a day beginning as it always did, and yet not the same. Finally, he turned back toward his house, taking a few slow steps, then stopping once more to look over his shoulder at the grave, at the cloth, at the place where everything had shifted without a single shot fired or a single demand made. He adjusted his hat slightly, a habit more than anything, and then continued walking, the leather band still in his hand, not held tight, not loose, just carried. And as he reached the edge of his porch, Elias Boone realized something he had not expected, that out here, where the land stretched farther than a man could claim, and the wind carried stories without asking who they belonged to, justice had not come with noise or force. It had come quietly, in the form of a door opened, a life respected, and a choice that stayed standing long after everyone else had ridden away.